In the 1980s, the Moffitt family lived a simple life in Southern California, but their lives completely changed when they came face to face with a demonic presence that took shelter in their home for nearly 7 years. Lee discovered a message on the bathroom mirror written in soap, and it said, "Talk to me." At first, they thought one of the family members was just messing around, playing a prank, because clearly someone must have written it. But nobody confessed, and after 2 minutes, Deborah headed back into the bathroom. Fresh writing was scrawled across the mirror. The words said, "No escape." And the next day, a new message filled the entire mirror, and it said, "I hate Lee, and Lee die." The family would find carpets torn to shreds, and then symbols began appearing on the house walls that looked like they were carved with a knife. Tensions between Bill Sr. and Lee began to spark more than usual, and one night when they headed to bed, Bill Sr. and Lee discovered that their mattress had been torn to shreds, and they took this as a violent threat. But then the entity began throwing sharp knives. From then on, more knives began to appear in the house, and they were always in spots where Lee would often sit or lie down, like chairs, pillows, couches, or even her bed. One time, 6 kitchen knives mysteriously appeared in her bed. Its new tactic was to bring objects from places the family had been. It wanted the Moffitts to realize that it had followed them wherever they went. It brought mementos back from Lake Tahoe after the family visited for the weekend. It even brought name tags of waitresses that had served them at dinner. Even when Deborah and Bill Jr. traveled to different towns to meet with potential paranormal experts, the entity went with them. The marking of the triangle with the S-shaped curve could be found on hotel walls or wherever they went. Toward the end of 1988, they found a woman named Redwing that identified as a Native American shaman at a local psychic fair. A few days later, Redwing came to their home with another fellow shaman named Fire Panther. They burned a bundle of sage and waved smoke through the second story with a large feather. Then they moved towards the attic and wafted the smoke up through the entryway. After a moment, though, the smoke blew back out of the attic like something was rejecting it. There was no draft and the attic was insulated, so the 3 of them crawled into the attic. Once inside, they clicked on the light, and Deborah braced herself near the doorway. Fire Panther then burned more sage and began chanting in a steady rhythm. Then the attic began to creak, and Deborah noticed a roll of fiberglass insulation slowly sliding down the wall. The insulation contorted and shifted until the outline of a face began to reveal itself. Cheekbones and a chin could be seen in the insulation. A spiraling horn appeared where one of the ears would be, turning clockwise around the head. Deborah watched as the deep-set eyes began to take shape in the face. For several seconds, the insulation held the imprint of a face, but then it fell to the floor. But Fire Panther said he had successfully removed a paranormal manifestation from Bill Sr. and placed it in Bill's dog, named Jeff. As the only way for them to move the manifestation was to place it into something else. He had done the best that he could, but Bill Sr.'s dog passed away soon after, and luckily a new paranormal team was on the horizon, as Deborah had reached out to the legendary Ed and Lorraine Warren and told them about what the family had been experiencing. They all sat in the living room in a U-shape while Ed read a series of opening prayers. As he spoke, they all noticed a heavy presence enter the room. Later during the ceremony, Bill Sr. slumped forward, his spine curved, and he pulled his arms toward his chest. Something inside him had shifted. When he got to his feet, he growled like an animal and moved toward Ed, dragging one leg behind him like he was injured. As he approached, Ed pulled out a small glass vial that held a small shard of wood. He held it in front of himself for protection, shouting that the shard of wood was a section of the Holy Cross, and it protected him. At that moment, Bill Sr. snarled like an animal and showed his teeth. When he began to speak, the family noticed his voice had changed, and he told Ed that he would bite his hand off, chew it up, and spit it in his face. Neither of the men retreated, but after the standoff, Bill Sr. eventually crept back to his seat. The Warrens claimed that the entity had taken control of Bill Sr. for a brief amount of time. During the Warrens' visits, Ed explained that there was nothing personally they could do to make the entity leave, and Lorraine believed that the demon was attached to Lee, so moving wouldn't help. Lee had gone into the kitchen pantry by herself when Deborah and Bill Jr. heard a frantic pounding on the pantry door. When they ran into the kitchen, they noticed the pantry door was jammed. They eventually wrenched the door open and found Lee lying on the ground. Red rings covered her neck, and she claimed that the entity had tried to strangle her. After this attack, Deborah realized that she had to do something, so she told the entity that it would no longer harm her family. Moments later, writing appeared on the bathroom wall. It said, "I will not touch your child. I will not touch your husband, but Lee belongs to me." Her youngest son Jamie was safe, and so was Bill Jr., but the presence wouldn't stop targeting Lee. Then it went on to talk about a rambling story of a French monastery in the 1600s. In and it told the story of a group of monks performing a blood ritual. They'd actually captured a nun and planned to sacrifice her, but one of the monks betrayed the group before the nun could be sacrificed, and she was able to escape. The entity said that in a past life, Lee was the nun who escaped, but now the entity finally had her back in its clutches, and it was out for blood. So Deborah believed that she had to defy the entity as much as she could. So instead of calling it Prince like it had told them months ago, Deborah began calling it Mr. Entity. She believed this was a way to constantly disrespect the presence in their home. After a few more simple back and forths, Deborah went into the bathroom and saw these words on the mirror: "Lee will die in 10 days. The entity had always threatened Lee, but this was the first specific threat that they had come across. Deborah thought that the entity was bluffing, because if it could have killed Lee, wouldn't it have done it already? But on the final day of the countdown, the family knows that Lee suffered from shortness of breath early in the morning. They rushed her to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with pneumonia and congestive heart failure. Bill Sr. and Deborah alternated hospital visits to keep her company. And while Lee was in the hospital, the entity barely bothered the rest of them at home. As time passed, Lee recovered slowly. Eventually, she was well enough to come home. When Deborah and Lee were alone in the family room, Lee leaned over to whisper to Deborah. She said that while she was in the hospital, the entity had actually come to visit her. Every time Lee had regained consciousness in the hospital room, she'd look up and see a small black stain on the ceiling. It would writhe across the room and seep down the wall toward the hospital bed. Once it crept up next to the bed, a pillar of shadow would extend from the black stain. It loomed near her bedside, and a thin dark limb would emerge from its body. In the small distance between the dark limb and Lee, a bright mist formed. Its shape turned into the form of an old woman staring back at Lee. Looking closer, she saw that it was her late mother, Dominica. While Lee recovered at home, the doctors told the family her recovery would be a long process. She had to carry an oxygen tank and wear tubes in her nostrils. She'd often wake up in the night and Deborah would hear her gasping for air. And then she discovered that the oxygen tubes had been severed from the tank, and they were all quick to blame Mr. Entity. While alone, Lee had seen a black shadow hanging from the second-story balcony above her. She thought it might have been Bill Sr., but the shadow stretched itself over the railing and then floated down above Lee. Black tentacles extended from its body and just hovered just above Lee. The figure continued to inch closer, and Lee could see its gaping mouth and two lifeless eyes take shape. Lee was able to gather up enough strength to get up from the couch and run. The figure chased her for a moment and then vanished just before she burst into the master bedroom where Deborah and Bill Jr. were. So after the incident, Bill Sr. woke up screaming late in the night. Something cold and metal had passed along his leg, and when they turned on the lights, he revealed it was a large dagger with a long hilt. What was weird is that none of them recognized the dagger, but they all assumed that the entity was responsible. At this point, Deborah had had enough. She charged into the bathroom to communicate with the entity, but when she opened the door, she noticed messages had already been scrawled across the mirror, and it read, "There must be a blood ritual. Take the spear and stab it into Lee's heart." In the summer of 1989, they found a woman named Dr. Evelyn Paglini from Chicago. She claimed she was an expert in parapsychology and a practitioner of magic. She had relocated to California and inspected the Moffitt family home in person, and she gave them directions to inscribe symbols and messages on the bathroom mirror. Every shape they drew was crossed out by the entity. After their findings, Evelyn believed there was a demon in their home, and this demon was a prince. It was actually one of the 7 princes of hell. She claimed that they couldn't be removed because Bill Sr. was the one keeping it tethered to the home, saying that they should keep the upstairs clear and try to please the entity for as long as they could. It could make their life easier, and it was the only way they could save Lee. But Lee refused. She was dedicated to her faith and didn't want to welcome a demon into their home. By late 1990, Deborah noticed that Bill Sr. had drastically changed over the months. When Lee would go to bed, she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to Bill Sr. sitting upright at the edge of the bed, mumbling to himself. He would then turn to stare at her in the dark without saying a word. After a while, Lee forbid Bill Sr. from staying in the first-floor master bedroom with them. Instead of taking the first-floor guest bedroom, he headed back up to the second floor to sleep every night. A few nights later, everyone woke up to the sound of howling coming from the upstairs bedroom. Deborah ran upstairs to find Bill Sr. with his nose in the air, howling like a wolf. It also looked like he was still asleep, like he he was in a deep dream, sleepwalking. When she shook him, he woke up in a daze and then immediately fell back to sleep. One afternoon, Deborah heard someone constantly going in and out of the bathroom. When she looked down the hall, she spotted Bill Sr. sneaking down the hall toward the kitchen. Deborah took a look inside the bathroom and saw smudges of soap across the mirror. It had just recently been wiped clean. Deborah asked the entity if Bill Sr. had been speaking with him, and the entity responded, saying, "This little prick wants me to kill Lee. He cannot command me." Deborah then secretly spoke to Lee and told her that Bill Sr. was conspiring against her. Lee told her that just the day before, she caught Bill Sr. rifling through her old bank statements upstairs. It turned out Lee had inherited a lot of wealth from her family, and she and her husband didn't share a joint bank account. Bill Sr. had no access to the account or the money, and everything became clear to Deborah. Bill Sr. would only get half the money in a divorce, but if Lee died, he would get almost everything. Bill Sr. agreed to a full 2-week psychological evaluation. While he was there, the rest of the Moffitts noticed that Mr. Entity's presence in the house had faded away. After the 2 weeks were up, Bill Sr. passed the evaluation. When they went to pick him up, Lee went into the hospital alone to get him as the rest of the family waited in the car. Moments later, they watched as she stormed back out of the building. Outraged, Lee said that Bill Sr. and the doctors cornered her in a room and claimed that she had fabricated Mr. Entity. Moments later, Bill came out of the building and got in the van with them. He told Lee that she was an embarrassment to the entire family. And when they got back to the house, Lee turned to Bill Sr. and told him he wouldn't step 1 foot in their house. She told him to then pack a suitcase and leave. Bill Sr. controlled his anger the best he could, and he packed up a few things and then left, but he promised them he would be back. So after 2 months passed without Bill Sr. in the house, the rest of the Moffitts realized that Bill Sr. had been a constant negative presence in their lives, and they were relieved that he was gone. It felt like a weight had been lifted from the house, and the presence in their home faded more and more each day. As years passed, there wasn't much of a threat from the entity anymore, but they still reached out to more paranormal experts. Their life at home had turned into a coexistence with the entity. Most of the time, it only talked about Lee's life, her childhood, and random facts. The entity also returned to sending random objects into the home. Most were gifts like pendants, rocks, bells, and photographs of strangers. Deborah didn't know if these were genuine gifts or some sort of distraction, and she couldn't figure out what the entity wanted any longer. So the entity wouldn't leave, but it also seemed like its mission to kill Lee had also been put to rest. And by October 1992, the entity had been with them for 6 years. After surviving the worst of it, Deborah figured she would try one last time to try and get rid of Mr. Entity once and for all. She then approached the bathroom mirror and said, "Dad's gone and he's not coming back. There's no one to keep you here. No one to feed you the hatred you crave. Time for you to leave, Mr. Entity." Its reply came back in small, compact letters on the mirror later in the day. "Please let me stay here," it said. One last message was left in the bathroom. "Goodbye, my family." And as the months passed, there was no more paranormal activity in the house. Bill Jr. and Lee still lived with the trauma. They weren't ready to live on their own, so they stayed in the master bedroom together. Together, the three of them promised to never speak about Mr. Entity again. They feared that if they did, it would return. As for Bill Sr. and Lee, they divorced in 1994, and that was the last that they ever heard of him. Lee later passed away in 2009, and Bill Jr. passed in 2012. Deborah is now the last one alive that witnessed these extraordinary events. Her daughter Jessica later found out about Mr. Entity, and Deborah eventually broke her promise about never speaking about him again. Deborah's daughter Jessica has claimed she still feels the presence of something unnatural residing in their house.